The fire was still burning when they found his camp. Not embers, not ash. Fire. Active. Fed. Throwing heat into the cold morning air the way a fire does when someone has been tending it. The search team leader, a man named Carl Puente, with 14 years of wilderness search and rescue in the Rocky Mountain West, pulled up to the campsite at first light on October 18th and stepped out of his truck. He noted the fire immediately. Then he noted the camp chair facing it, positioned the way a person positions a chair when they plan to sit for a while. Then he noted the camp stove on the folding table. Then he noted the rifle leaning against the table's leg. And then he noticed the coffee mug. It was sitting on a flat rock at the edge of the fire ring, a dark green mug, the kind with a rubber grip. Still upright, still full, he could see, because the steam was coming off it. Carl Puente stood at that campsite for a moment before he said anything to the other members of his team. He said later that what he felt in that moment wasn't concern or urgency. It was something he found harder to name. He said it felt like he had walked into a room where someone had just been. Not an abandoned camp. A camp that was mid-use. A camp where the only thing missing was the person using it. The rifle was there. The vehicle was there. The food supply was there. The sleeping bag was inside the tent, zipped open at the top the way it looks when someone has gotten out of it in the morning and not yet made it back. Everything a person needs to survive in that terrain, in late October, at that elevation. Everything. Except the man who had brought it all there. His name was Robert Harkin. He was 61 years old. He had been camping and hunting in the Gallatin National Forest of south-central Montana for more than 30 years. And the coffee he had poured himself that morning was still sitting beside his campfire, going cold. That mug, that slowly cooling cup of coffee beside a fire that nobody was tending, is the image that has stayed with everyone who has worked this case, because the mug tells you something. It tells you that Robert Harkin had made a plan for the morning. You don't pour coffee at a campfire unless you intend to sit down and drink it. You don't set it beside the fire ring and walk away. Not voluntarily. Not unless something happened between the pouring and the sitting that changed everything. What that something was, what made Robert Harkin leave the safety of a burning fire, a full coffee mug, his rifle, his vehicle, and everything he needed to survive, is the question that this investigation has never answered. And it's the only question that matters. Robert Harkin had been in this specific part of the Gallatin for 11 seasons. He had a campsite he returned to every year, a flat, sheltered clearing about half a mile from a Forest Service access road, at roughly 8,000 feet elevation. He had improved it over the years. The fire ring was his. The stack of split wood beside it was his. The folding table where he set up his stove was his. He was, by every account, the kind of person who was more competent in that terrain than most people are in their own homes. His hunting partner of 16 years, a man named Gary Ferris, had hunted with Robert in that exact spot every October. He told investigators that Robert knew the Gallatin backcountry the way Gary knew his own neighborhood. Not just the main trails, but the drainage patterns, the game movement, the weather indicators specific to that canyon system, the places where radio contact was possible, and the places where it wasn't. Gary described Robert's level of competence in that terrain in a specific way. He said that whenever the two of them were out there together and something unexpected happened, a weather change, an unfamiliar sound, a shift in the animal movement, Gary's instinct was to look at Robert. Not a map, not a compass. Robert. Because Robert always knew what it meant. That was the person who was gone. Not a beginner who made a mistake. Not someone who had wandered into terrain beyond their capability. The person who, by Gary's account, represented the benchmark of what competence in those mountains looked like. Robert had gone up on October 15th, 3 days before Gary was supposed to join him. He liked to spend the first few days scouting alone. Gary would arrive on the 18th. They'd hunt together for 4 days, and then they'd pack out. Gary arrived on the morning of October 18th. The fire was burning. The coffee was beside it. Robert was not there. Gary spent 20 minutes searching the immediate camp area, calling Robert's name, before he called Gallatin County Search and Rescue. He told the dispatcher that Robert's rifle was at camp. He said it twice, because Gary Ferris knew what it meant for Robert Harkin's rifle to be at camp. Robert didn't go 20 feet into the woods without his rifle, not because he was afraid, but because it was a habit so ingrained after 30 years of hunting that the rifle went where Robert went. Always. The rifle at camp was not a detail. It was an anomaly. It was the thing that told Gary, before any search had begun, that whatever had happened to Robert hadn't happened the way things normally happen in the backcountry. Let's go back to the last evening, because the picture that investigators reconstructed of Robert's final confirmed hours is, in many ways, more unsettling than the campsite discovery. Not because it reveals anything dramatic, because it reveals nothing unusual at all. Robert had spoken to his wife, Linda, by satellite communicator on the evening of October 17th. The Gallatin Canyon had no cell service at a campsite, but Robert carried a satellite messaging device and checked in every evening. His message on the evening of October 17th was logged at 7:14 p.m. It said, "Good day. Saw elk sign on the north slope. Cold tonight. Fire going. Talk tomorrow." Linda replied at 7:31 p.m. "Stay warm. See you when you're home." That was the last communication Robert Harkin sent. Investigators analyzed the message for any indication of stress or concern. There was none. The message was exactly what Robert's messages always looked like. Precise, brief, practical. He reported what he'd seen and what the conditions were. He mentioned the fire. "Fire going," he wrote. Those 2 words, in the middle of an otherwise routine check-in, take on a different weight when you read them, knowing what the next 12 hours hold. He was at the fire at 7:14 p.m. He told Linda it was going. He said he'd talk tomorrow. And then, sometime in the next 12.5 hours, between the last message of October 17th and Gary's arrival on the morning of October 18th, Robert Harkin made a cup of coffee, set it beside that fire, and walked north. He never sent the message he'd promised. The next morning, the fire was still going when Gary arrived at approximately 7:45 a.m. That's a gap of 12.5 hours between Robert's last message and Gary's arrival. And in that 12.5 hours, something happened at that campsite. The fire was maintained overnight. Someone, and the only person at that camp was Robert, had added wood to keep it going. A campfire doesn't burn for 12 hours on its own. It needs fuel. Robert had been tending the fire through the night, and then, At some point before Gary arrived at 7:45 in the morning, Robert had left. Left the fire. Left the coffee. Left the rifle. Left everything. And walked into the forest in late October, at 8,000 feet, in temperatures that had dropped to 19 degrees overnight. The question isn't whether something happened. Something happened. The question is what? Carl Puente's initial assessment of the campsite was methodical. He noted every item, its condition, and its position. The coffee mug was in his report. The fire's active state was in his report. The rifle, a bolt-action hunting rifle, chambered, leaning against the table leg at a slight angle, was in his report. He also noted something that wasn't in any of the photographs taken at the scene: the camp chair. The camp chair was not pushed back from the fire ring in the way it looks when someone stands up quickly. It was positioned forward, angled toward the fire, the way it looks when someone has been sitting in it and leaning toward the warmth. Carl Puente described the chair's position in his report as consistent with someone having sat in it recently. But Robert wasn't sitting in it. There was one piece of physical evidence pointing to where Robert had gone: a partial boot impression at the northern edge of the campsite, in a small section of soft soil where a seep had kept the ground from freezing. The impression was partial, less than half a print, but consistent with the size and tread of Robert's boots. It was pointing north. North at that campsite meant uphill, toward the ridge above the camp, away from the access road, away from every terrain feature that would make sense as a morning destination. North was the direction of steeper, harder ground, in the dark, in 19-degree cold, without a rifle, without a pack. Carl Puente looked at that partial print, and then looked at his map. He thought about a 61-year-old man who had tended his fire through the night, who had poured himself a cup of coffee, and then walked north. He said he couldn't make it make sense. Not from a search and rescue standpoint. Not from any standpoint. He started the search moving north. The search expanded rapidly on day 1. By noon, 47 searchers were organized, and a helicopter from Bozeman was doing aerial passes. 2 tracking dog teams were deployed from the campsite, given Robert's scent from his sleeping bag, and sent north. Both teams tracked confidently for approximately half a mile. Then, at a point near the base of the steep section leading up to the ridge, both dogs showed unusual behavior. Not the circling uncertainty that handlers recognize when scent has degraded. Something more abrupt. Both dogs indicated at a specific area of rocky ground, worked it intensively, and then pulled back. Reapproached. Pulled back again. The lead handler, Sandra Voss, wrote in her log. Both animals showed atypical reluctance behavior at a specific terrain location. Not consistent with scent loss, consistent with strong scent concentration at a fixed point. Subject may have stopped at this location. Robert may have stopped at that point, or something happened at that point. The rocky section was searched by hand on day 1 and again on day 2. No Robert. No gear. No blood. No disturbance. On day 3, a 3rd dog team was brought in. Fresh animals, clean scent material, no knowledge of where the previous teams had stopped. The 3rd team stopped at the same location. Carl Puente asked Sandra Voss, plainly, what she believed the dogs were telling him. She said, "When a dog tracks to an endpoint and the scent trail ends, the behavior is specific. The dog loses confidence, circles, tries to pick up a direction, and eventually shows that the trail is gone. That's a normal endpoint. She paused. This wasn't that. The dogs weren't losing the trail. They were finding the trail at that location, finding strong concentration, and then choosing not to continue past it. That's a different thing. Puente asked her what would cause that. She said she didn't know. She said she had seen dogs behave that way at locations where a violent event had occurred, where there was something in the environment the animal was responding to aversively. But there was no physical evidence of any event at that location. She said she could not give him a satisfying explanation. She said the most honest thing she could tell him was that 3 experienced tracking dogs with a combined total of 42 years of search work had each independently indicated that something significant had occurred at that specific point in that rocky section, and that she could not tell him what. The rocky section was photographed from multiple angles. The photographs are in the case file. In none of them does the location look like anything other than what it is, an unremarkable section of hillside. 3 dog teams, the same location, the same behavior. No explanation. Now let's return to the campfire, because the campfire is not just a detail. The campfire is a timeline. A campfire at elevation in October. The search expanded rapidly on day 1. By noon, 47 searchers were organized, and a helicopter from Bozeman was doing aerial passes. 2 tracking dog teams were deployed from the campsite, given Robert's scent from his sleeping bag, and sent north. Both teams tracked confidently for approximately half a mile. Then, at a point near the base of the steep section leading up to the ridge, both dogs showed unusual behavior. Not the circling uncertainty that handlers recognize when scent has degraded. Something more abrupt. Both dogs indicated at a specific area of rocky ground, worked it intensively, and then pulled back. Reapproached, pulled back again. The lead handler, Sandra Voss, wrote in her log, "Both animals showed atypical reluctance behavior at a specific terrain location, not consistent with scent loss, consistent with strong scent concentration at a fixed point. Subject may have stopped at this location. Robert may have stopped at that point, or something happened at that point. The rocky section was searched by hand on day 1 and again on day 2. No Robert. No gear. No blood. No disturbance. On day 3, a 3rd dog team was brought in. Fresh animals, clean scent material, no knowledge of where the previous teams had stopped. The 3rd team stopped at the same location. Carl Puente asked Sandra Voss, plainly, what she believed the dogs were telling him. She said, "When a dog tracks to an end point and the scent trail ends, the behavior is specific. The dog loses confidence, circles, tries to pick up a direction, and eventually shows that the trail is gone. That's a normal end point." She paused. This wasn't that. The dogs weren't losing the trail. They were finding the trail at that location, finding strong concentration, and then choosing not to continue past it. That's a different thing. Puente asked her what would cause that. She said she didn't know. She said she had seen dogs behave that way at locations where a violent event had occurred, where there was something in the environment the animal was responding to aversively. But there was no physical evidence of any event at that location. She said she could not give him a satisfying explanation. She said the most honest thing she could tell him was that 3 experienced tracking dogs with a combined total of 42 years of search work had each independently indicated that something significant had occurred at that specific point in that rocky section, and that she could not tell him what. The rocky section was photographed from multiple angles. The photographs are in the case file. In none of them does the location look like anything other than what it is: an unremarkable section of hillside, 3 dog teams, the same location, the same behavior. No explanation. Now let's return to the campfire, because the campfire is not just a detail. The campfire is a timeline. A campfire at elevation in October burns for approximately 2 to 3 hours on a standard load of wood before it needs to be fed. Robert's fire ring held a generous amount of wood. Gary noted that the wood supply beside the ring had been significantly depleted compared to what Robert typically kept stacked. Robert had been feeding that fire through the night. Investigators estimated at least 3, possibly 4 separate additions of wood over the course of the night. Each addition required a deliberate act: assessing the fire, retrieving wood, adding it at the right intervals. The last addition was estimated to have been made approximately 90 minutes to 2 hours before Gary's arrival. That puts it at roughly 6 to 6:30 in the morning. So, at 6 a.m., approximately, Robert was still at camp. Functioning, present. And by 7:45, he was gone. That window, 6 a.m. to 7:45, is the most critical 90 minutes in this entire investigation. Think about what the physical evidence tells you about those 90 minutes. Robert tended the fire between 6 and 6:30. Then, based on the coffee timeline, he went to his camp stove. He heated water. He made coffee. He poured it into the dark green mug with the rubber grip. He carried it to the fire ring and set it on the flat rock he used as a side table. The camp chair was positioned forward, angled toward the fire. He had everything in place. He was about to begin the part of the morning he had been preparing for, and then he didn't. You don't pour coffee and set it on a rock in 19-degree cold unless you intend to sit down immediately and drink it. You pour coffee, you sit with it, you drink it while it's hot. Robert poured the coffee. He set it on the flat rock. He didn't drink it. Something happened between the pouring and the sitting. That gap, the gap between a man placing his coffee mug on a rock and a man walking north without his rifle, is the center of this mystery. The mug tells you the sequence. The chair tells you the intention. The fire tells you he was there, present, deliberate, until moments before. And none of it tells you why he left. On day 2, investigators collected statements from all 7 occupied camps within 3 miles of Robert's site. 5 produced nothing relevant. The 6th camp, occupied by Martin Pell and his son Jake, produced a detail investigators spent considerable time trying to place. Martin told them that at some point between 2 and 4 a.m., he had heard something outside his tent he didn't recognize. Not an animal, not a human voice. A sustained sound from the direction of the forest, lasting less than a minute. He hadn't gotten up. He'd assumed it was wildlife and gone back to sleep. His son Jake hadn't heard it. The direction Martin pointed, northwest, was the direction of Robert's camp. The 7th camp produced the detail that redirected the investigation entirely. Cheryl Oates was a solo hunter, experienced, who kept careful observation notes. She was approximately 2 miles from Robert's campsite in a drainage to the northeast. At approximately 5:15 in the morning on October 18th, she stepped outside her tent to check conditions. While standing there, she saw a light. not a sweeping beam, a stationary glow in the direction of the high ground to the southwest, the direction of Robert's camp and the ridge above it. The light was stationary for approximately 3 minutes. Then it went out. She went back inside. Investigators checked all 7 camps. None were in the direction Cheryl had indicated. The Forest Service road had not been traveled that morning. A muddy section at the trailhead showed no fresh tire tracks. No other camper or hunter reported being in that location. Investigators took Cheryl back to her campsite on day 3 and established a precise bearing. The geometry placed the light's origin at one of 2 locations: Robert's campsite itself or the slope immediately above it. If the light was at Robert's campsite, it meant he was there and functioning at 5:15 a.m. If the light was on the slope above, someone or something already moving uphill, it meant Robert had left camp before 5:15 in the morning, before the estimated last fire tending at 6 to 6:30, which would mean either the fire tending timeline was wrong, or someone else tended that fire after Robert left. Carl Puente described this in the case file as an irresolvable ambiguity. He did not draw a conclusion, but the timing and direction of Cheryl's light could not be set aside. At 5:15 a.m., there was a light where Robert's camp was, or above it. What it was has never been determined. On day 4 of the search, a team working the rocky bench at the top of the ridge found a section of disturbed ground where the bench transitioned from open rock to sparse timber. A member of the team with tracking experience noted the disturbance pattern was consistent with a person having stood, shifted weight, and moved. Wrong in size and pattern for any quadruped. A forensic tracker brought in on day 5 assessed it cautiously. Consistent with human foot traffic, but not definitive given the elapsed time. The location was on the bench above the ridge, above the point where the dogs had stopped. From that location, you could see the drainage on the far side. Not the campsite, the far side of the ridge. If that disturbed ground was Robert's, he had climbed 800 feet in the dark, without a rifle, without a pack, in 19-degree cold. And he had stood at the top of that ridge and looked into the drainage beyond. The drainage was searched on days 5 and 6. No Robert. The search ran for 11 days. More than 160 volunteers worked the terrain in organized grid teams. 3 separate helicopter sweeps used thermal imaging to scan the ridge system and the drainages on both sides. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office coordinated with Idaho Search and Rescue for resources. Gary Ferris organized additional volunteer teams in the first week. On day 11, with no findings and deteriorating weather moving in from the northwest, the active search was scaled back. Robert Harkin has never been found. Not a piece of clothing, not a boot, not a bone, not any item from his campsite that he might have taken with him. 11 years and 11 separate subsequent searches, organized by volunteers, by the family, by Gary Ferris, have covered additional terrain in the Gallatin backcountry. Each one has come back without a result. The only physical evidence associated with Robert's post-camp movements is a partial boot print pointing north from the campsite and a possible disturbance on the ridge bench 4 days into the search. Both have qualifications. Both are uncertain. What has no qualifications is the campsite. What has no qualifications is the mug and the fire and the rifle and the chair. The fire was still burning at 7:45 a.m. The coffee was still in the mug. The rifle was still at the table. The chair was still facing the warmth, forward, angled toward the fire, the way you position a chair when you plan to use it. Robert Harkin prepared his camp for a morning he never had. He left a burning fire, a full coffee mug, a loaded rifle, and a chair positioned toward the warmth. And he walked north. And he didn't come back. Let's talk about what those four objects mean when you hold them together. Not separately. Together. Because each one adds something to the picture that the others don't provide alone. The fire. Feeding a campfire through the night is not a passive act. It requires repeated, deliberate judgment across multiple hours. Assessing the fire, deciding it needs wood, retrieving wood from the stack, adding it at the right quantity and angle. Investigators estimated Robert did this at least 3, possibly 4 separate times through the night. Each time, he woke or roused himself, made a decision, and acted on it. This is not the behavior of someone in crisis. It is not the behavior of someone confused or disoriented. It is the behavior of a man who is awake, thinking clearly, and choosing to maintain his own warmth in a 19-degree night. The coffee, a mug poured and set on a rock beside a campfire, tells you something specific about the person's intentions in the next 60 seconds. You don't set hot coffee down in cold air and walk away from it. You set it down because you're about to be sitting next to it. The mug tells you Robert's plan for the next 60 seconds was to be in his camp chair, drinking his coffee, watching the fire. The rifle. In 16 years of hunting together, Gary Ferris said he had never once seen Robert separate from his rifle in the field. Never. For any reason. The rifle's presence at camp tells you that whatever happened, the departure was not the kind of departure Robert had ever made before. It was either faster than any decision he'd consciously made about his rifle, or it was a departure in which the rifle wasn't part of his thinking at all. The chair. Positioned forward, angled toward the fire, in the exact orientation of a chair someone intends to sit in. Not pushed back, not moved aside. Facing the warmth, 4 objects. Each one says the same thing in a different way. Robert was in the middle of his morning. The departure was not planned, and whatever caused it came quickly enough, or completely enough, that he left all 4 of them behind without resolution. The fire still burning, the coffee going cold, the rifle at the table, the chair facing the warmth, waiting for someone who never came back to sit in it. That is the factual record of Robert Harkin's campsite on the morning of October 18th. And that record has never been explained. Now let's talk about what investigators considered and why nothing fully holds. The medical explanation. Robert's last physical was 8 months prior. Some managed hypertension, nothing flagged as acute. Cardiac events and sudden neurological episodes can strike without warning. But a person in a severe dissociative state or neurological crisis doesn't tend to fire methodically through the night, doesn't heat water and make coffee in the pre-dawn dark, doesn't set a mug down and position a chair. The medical theory accounts for why he left without his rifle. It accounts for the direction not making sense. It doesn't account for the fire. It doesn't account for the sequence. It doesn't account for a man functioning normally at 6:45 in the morning. The sound or sight explanation. Something he heard or saw caused him to react immediately, quickly enough that the rifle wasn't part of the reaction. An animal encounter would typically prompt retrieval of a firearm, not abandonment of one. Something that sounded like a person in distress, another hunter calling for help in the pre-dawn dark, could explain immediate movement without stopping for gear. If Robert heard someone in trouble, in terrain he knew well, the instinct might be to move toward the sound first and worry about the rifle after. But none of the 7 camps reported anyone in distress that night. No welfare call was filed that morning. No one in the area reported hearing another person cry out. If Robert heard something, it was something no one else in those 7 camps heard clearly enough to investigate. And if he went to investigate it, it led him north, uphill, into harder terrain, in the dark, and didn't bring him home. The light explanation. Cheryl's sighting places something in the vicinity of Robert's camp, or the slope above it, at 5:15 a.m. If Robert saw a light on the ridge, something unexpected, in terrain he knew intimately, he might have gone to investigate. Left quickly, expecting to be back in minutes. Didn't think to take the rifle for what seemed like a brief walk. But what was the light? And why did going to look at it mean never coming home? The foul play explanation. Robert's personal life showed no conflicts. Gary's alibi was verified. No other person was identified as knowing the camp's location. No evidence of violence was found. No motive surfaced. Foul play cannot be ruled out. It never can, without a resolution. But the investigation produced nothing to support it. Every explanation has a gap. Every explanation leaves something that doesn't fit. And every explanation, when you follow it far enough, comes back to the same 3 objects. The fire, still burning. The mug, still full. The chair, still facing the warmth. If Robert was incapacitated by a medical event, who positioned that chair with such deliberate intention toward the fire? If he heard something alarming, why did he set his coffee down carefully before he left? If he went to investigate something and intended to return quickly, where is he? 3 objects. 3 questions that no version of events resolves cleanly. And in every version of events, the question is the same. Why did he leave the campfire? There is a pattern in wilderness disappearance research that Robert Harkin's case fits precisely. David Polides, who has documented missing persons cases through public records requests and family interviews over more than a decade, has noted a specific cluster. Experienced outdoors, people who disappear from established camps, fire present, gear present, food present, in a way that suggests sudden, unprepared departure. The coffee beside the fire image appears in more than one documented case. Not always coffee. Sometimes food on a stove, sometimes a tent left open, a sleeping bag still warm. The physical signature of a camp that was mid-use when its occupant walked away from it. Polides notes these cases without advancing an explanation. His documentation is precise. Here are the facts. Here is what investigators found. Here is what remains unresolved. Because leaving a campfire is a decision. You don't accidentally leave a campfire. You don't forget it's there. You make a choice, conscious or not, to step away from the warmth. And when you look at these cases together, that choice is what they all share. Not the terrain, not the demographics, not the specific circumstances. The choice to leave warmth and shelter and equipment, suddenly, without preparation, in conditions where nothing about the preceding hours suggested anything was wrong. Robert Harkin's last message said the fire was going. His campsite 12 hours later showed a man who had been tending that fire through the night, who had poured his coffee, who had positioned his chair. Nothing in the evidence of those 12 hours suggested Robert was planning to go anywhere. And then he went. 2 briefcases to show Robert Harkin is not alone. In September of 2008, a hunter named Dale Orton disappeared from a campsite in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness of Idaho. 54 years old, 20 years in that wilderness. When his partner arrived to find him, the camp was occupied in every sense except Dale himself. The stove was on. Breakfast was on the stove. His rifle was at camp. Dale Orton was never found. In October of 2015, a camper named Frank Yates disappeared from the Shoshone National Forest of Wyoming. His camp was organized. His fire ring had fresh ash from the previous night. His truck keys were hanging on a nail inside his tent. His truck was at the camp. His keys were inside. Frank Yates was never found. 3 camps, 3 experienced outdoors people, 3 departures that left everything behind. And in each case, the same central fact. Fire or stove evidence that the person was present and functional shortly before they vanished, and no evidence of why they left. Robert Harkin's campsite was preserved by the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office through the end of the search. The fire was eventually allowed to burn down. The coffee mug was removed as part of the evidence processing. Linda Harkin asked to have it back after the investigation concluded. She was told it was still in the evidence log. She said she would wait. That mug, that dark green mug with the rubber grip, is in a property room in Gallatin County. Logged in evidence for a missing persons case that is still open, it may be there for years. The case file entry reads, ceramic mug, dark green, rubber grip, contents present at time of recovery. Contents present at time of recovery. His coffee was still in the mug when they logged it. There is a specific quality to that detail that stays with everyone who studies this case. Not that the coffee was there, but what the coffee's presence means. The coffee being in the mug when it was logged means Robert set it down and left before he drank any of it. It means the mug went cold on the rock beside the fire, and then colder, and then Gary arrived and found it, and then investigators arrived and logged it. And through all of that, the coffee sat in the mug because nobody was drinking it. Not because nobody wanted to, because the person who poured it was gone. That's what the evidence log entry says in the careful language of a property room inventory. Contents present at time of recovery. It says Robert poured his coffee and didn't come back for it. That's all it says. That's all it can say. The rest of it, why he poured it and didn't come back, is the question the case file cannot answer. Gary Ferris went back to that campsite the following October, not to hunt, just to go. He sat in Robert's camp chair by the fire ring. He made a fire. He made coffee. He said later that he kept looking north, at the slope rising into the ridge, at the timber above the campsite. He said, I keep coming back to the coffee. He poured himself coffee. He set it down. And whatever happened next happened so fast, or so completely, that he never picked it back up. He paused. You don't leave your coffee unless you have a reason. And whatever his reason was, it wasn't anything I can understand. Because he's gone. Gary Ferris sat at that campsite for most of a day. He watched the fire he had built burn down. He watched his own coffee go cold. He left before dark. He said he has not been back since. He said he doesn't think going back would answer anything. Because it never has. Robert Harkin's case remains open. No remains have been found in any of the 11 subsequent searches that volunteers and the family have organized in the Gallatin backcountry. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office accepts information through their non-emergency line. Carl Puente reviewed the case file 2 years after the initial search, as part of a cold case review the county initiated on its older open files. He read through every witness statement, every search log, every handler report. He looked at the photographs of the campsite again, the fire ring, the folding table, the rifle, the chair. He said in a brief statement to the county that the cold case review had produced no new leads and no change in the investigative conclusions. He said the case was the one in his career he returned to most often when he was thinking through how searches work and where their limits are. He said the campsite on the morning of October 18th represented, in his assessment, a documented scenario that he could not fully account for with the frameworks available to him. He said, "Everything I was trained to look for was there. The fire told me when he was present. The coffee told me when he stopped being present. The boot print told me which direction he went. What I couldn't find was why. And in 14 years of this work, I have never had a case where the why was so completely absent from the evidence. In hundreds of pages of documentation, in 11 years of searching and reviewing and analyzing, no investigator has been able to write a satisfactory answer to the question that Carl Puente stood with at that campsite on the morning of October 18th. Why did Robert Harkin leave his campfire? He had warmth. He had food. He had his rifle. He had a full cup of coffee. He had all of it. And he left. Without the rifle. Without the coffee. Without any of it. He walked north into a 19-degree morning, into terrain that gets steeper and harder as you climb. And whatever reason he had for doing that, whatever he saw or heard or thought in the minutes before Gary arrived, that reason left no evidence. It left only the campfire still burning, and the coffee mug going cold, and the camp chair still facing the warmth of a fire that nobody was tending anymore. Waiting. That's the image this case leaves behind. Not a dramatic moment. Not a defined event. A camp chair facing a fire, a mug of cooling coffee on a flat rock, and a slope rising north into the dark, with no explanation for why a man who knew better walked up it and never came back down.